Hi, my name is John Austin King, and today I'm going to be presenting my autoethnography entitled Queer Presence in Christian Church Music, Unraveling the Paradox. Despite centuries of religious persecution and subjugation, the queer person remains a long-standing, nearly ubiquitous pillar of Christian church music. This phenomenon, in which a sprawling religious institution has come to rely heavily on those whom it consistently repudiates, has prompted me to consider my own involvement in this institution as a gay man. Although the exact percentage of queer musicians in the Christian church is difficult to quantify because of the unfortunate necessity of non-disclosure in many cases, research pertaining to the LGBTQ+ population and other sectors of American life and work corroborates the assertion that queer people are omnipresent regardless of state, location, race, gender, or socioeconomic status. So what is it then that draws such large numbers of queer musicians to the church? In addition to understanding the why of this queer proliferation, it is crucial to understand the extent to which queer people must often assimilate to the ideological demands of a congregation for the sake of employment. Echoes of the suppressive don't ask, don't tell policies of the U.S. military still reverberate loudly in Christian churches as an unspoken social contract between religious employers, their congregation, and the queer musician. As the number of young Christians wanes rapidly and young queer people continue to gain exponentially more visibility in our society, the Christian church must reevaluate its traditional attitudes towards queer employees and queer people as a whole before a generation of potential artists and worshipers are lost and an entire genre of music so fundamental to American history evaporates into the mass consumerist culture that threatens to erase so many unique art forms. Drawing on my extensive personal experience and other existing ethnological research in this matter, I posit that validation of queer musicians in the Christian church is necessary for the preservation of traditional music making, and to tip the scale in favor of acceptance will require continued queer solidarity and subtle unionization efforts that are only now feasible in the age of information and technology. In order to contextualize this body of research relating to queer musicianship in the church, I will first detail my observations and personal experiences as a gay church pianist and singer over the course of the last 6 years. My variety of experiences places me in a unique position to analyze the aforewritten paradox. I've worked as a pianist and singer in both white and African American Christian churches across several Protestant denominations of varying queer acceptance, including the Methodist Church, the Baptist Church, the Presbyterian Church USA, the Associate Reformed Presbyterian, or ARP Church, since the age of 15. In none of these positions have I been privileged to disclose my sexual identity or feel comfortable in doing so. My queerness is particularly visible. In more colloquial terms, I'm flaming, and has been so since my childhood. So I can say with certainty that my sexuality does not go undetected by church employees and congregations. All 6 years of my life spent working in churches have required the formation of a rift in my personhood and a constant vigilance to ensure that this rift is not breached within the greater local community where I frequently encounter members of a given church. Ironically, in the most dismal sense, at least one other gay man has been employed in music ministry in almost every church I've worked for. Often, this mutual queer understanding goes unspoken, but not unacknowledged, between gay members of the music staff who rely on secrecy for employment and social acceptance. In all cases, the gradual realization that I provided such a crucial, if not the most important, element of Christian worship to a congregation who largely rejected the identity of myself and fellow music leaders soured my view and relationship to many churches. On many occasions, I witnessed homophobic outbursts from clergy members that confirmed the existence of an unspoken disdain in the church and deepened my feelings of fear and solitude among the supposed church family. I was disturbed to learn from a head pastor I knew well that on several occasions, members of the church in which I was raised had made private phone calls to him threatening to withdraw financial support if the associate pastor continued to preach about queer acceptance or if gay members were allowed to speak at topical church forums pertaining to the ordainment of aspiring queer ministers. Thus, the expectation that queer musicians should humbly divulge their talents to be exploited by homophobic congregations is a highly observable and ideological dangerous phenomenon. In essence, the cognitive dissonance allows homophobic clergy easier access to essential music services, and that they are able to suspend overt homophobia in communal church spaces for the greater good of musical worship, meanwhile decrying efforts towards queer legitimization in private. I regret that I'm often too afraid to directly combat this expectation for fear of placing my job in jeopardy. However, it is vitally important to recognize and deconstruct welcoming versus affirming attitudes in the church. Relevant ethnographic research and statistical data confirm the prevalence of this social peculiarity. Alicia Lola Jones examines the use of music making as a covert means of queer expression in Black churches in her ethnomusicological book entitled Flaming: The Particular Theopolitics of Fire and Desire in Black Male Gospel Performance. Her fieldwork also uncovers that homophobia in African American churches, as in many others, is a multifaceted issue stemming from a multitude of theological inconsistencies pertaining to gender and misogyny. Jones cites decreasing church participation among Black American men and its link to rampant misogyny in the Christian church. Evidenced by a number of recorded sermons and church initiatives, a large factor in this decrease is the perception by clergy that church is becoming too feminine, that the expressional expectations of church worship threaten individual masculinity and masculinity as a distinctive factor in assigning roles within a worship setting, and that to participate in animated solo singing is an affront to manhood. It is no surprise, then, that queer men quite frequently find a means of sexual expression in church music. Coined homomusicoerotics by Jones, as the flamboyant theatrics of performance can more easily be excused and attributed to religious conviction or the movement of the Holy Spirit directly through a person. Consequently, a vicious cycle is born in which heterosexual men who perform in church become objects of potential derision as effeminate, alienating them from the church and church music altogether. Naturally, music has always comprised a core part of my queer expression. Knowledge of esoteric music principles and forms distinguished me from my heterosexual peers and allowed me a greater range of physical and emotional expression. But, similar to trends noted in Jones' research, I was often relegated to the roles many of my heterosexual colleagues shied away from because of the implicit femininity or intense expression required of such roles. In yet another stark contrast to the situational reality of queer overrepresentation in church music, many employee contracts have a built-in morality clause, negating even the possibility of sexual disclosure in the church. These restrictions merely serve to hide gay presence in the church body, so that a church may continue to exploit the labor of queer people and remain outwardly theologically consistent. Testimony from gay priests in the Catholic Church suggests that the number of privately practicing queer priests far exceeds recorded numbers and contributes to an epidemic of clandestine behaviors in the church, such as pedophilia. Only once such barriers to self-expression are removed can queer people begin to heal from the trauma of religious oppression in the workplace. As in many large public and private institutions, churches often function as a slow-moving, tradition-bound bureaucracy in which progressive change is slow to take hold. However, queer musicians like myself are now in a more favorable position to demand respect and validation, primarily due to the advances in cultural thinking and mass information dissemination via the internet. Although resistance may often feel futile for the queer musician, and I myself have been in many religious situations where I found myself unable to act in the face of blatant homophobia, smaller case-by-case forms of resistance can and have led to more sweeping ideological change in the fabric of church communities. After all, churches are insular institutions, usually governed by local community members. Oftentimes, seemingly simple or small acts of resistance can draw out hidden support in the congregation of a church. Father Greg Greeton of St. Bernadette Catholic Parish in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, noted that his congregation was overwhelmingly supportive after he came out as gay. Although it is important to note that all priests are pledged to celibacy, so the role of this knowledge in the opinion of his congregation is difficult to ascertain. When an openly gay member of my home church was allowed to speak at a forum discussing the eligibility of gay men to be ordained, a clergy member's homophobic declaration, made aloud before the audience, was surprisingly denounced publicly by a highly respected theologian of the church, prompting a shift in the overall tone of the meeting and in the opinions of the church's more conservative members towards acceptance. Other documented instances of gay instrumentalists walking out of church services in response to homophobic sermons received unexpected support from their congregation due to the stir it caused. I've been surprised to find in some situations that church members will change their tune, so to speak, towards my identity when I express emotional pain or hardship that has stemmed from suppression, feeling at odds with their admitted love for me as a person and the pain that people like them have caused to queer people. Although many sects of Christianity are simply past the point of return, such as fundamentalist practices, and it would be impractical to apply the aforementioned methods as a generalized method for queer acceptance, in many instances, the catalyst for ideological change within individual congregations is the act of disclosure and emotional appeal. In almost every instance, on both scales large and small, this bombshell creates a ripple of opinion that often creates unsealable rifts in the church. For gay church musicians, however, this situation is more likely favorable. A potential split in the Methodist Church, for example, resulting from disagreement over queer minister ordainment, will ultimately allow the new progressive sect to embrace wider swaths of its individual communities and hopefully stimulate an increasingly disinterested demographic of young queer and non-queer people into action. Inevitably, churches entrenched in stifling moral codes will fall to the wayside, as has already happened in other historic church splits. The more progressive Presbyterian Church USA now dwarfs Reformed denominations such as the ARP and Presbyterian Church in America in membership. National trends, too, show increasing acceptance of LGBTQ Americans, so in many ways it is simply a matter of keeping the momentum of national change through individual action. Although I have not had the opportunity to disclose my identity in church, I hope to find a way to share this in the near future with church people who I work with, sparking discussion among clergy members and staff. Considering the chief importance of music in Christian worship and the vitality of queer people in the creation and performance of this music, it is unconscionable for the church to relegate any of its employees to silence, and this practice constitutes a violation of human dignity that would not be tolerated in any non-religious workplace. The path for queer acceptance in religion is never simple, but with continued resistance on the local level, the hearts of many Christians can be moved in a way that I myself have witnessed over years of dedicated music ministry. And I resolve to assume a more active role in this necessary process as I cross the precipice of adulthood and launch a career in music. Thank you.
Then I wasn't really sure what to do. I was faced with the choice to sit as everyone else does, as per usual, and listen to this message be delivered, or I could do something. So I literally got up and walked out the door. The pastor didn't know I was gay. Most of the church did not know either. I was in the back for a couple of minutes while he was still doing his speech, and a couple of my friends, a couple of straight allies, they were at that point, they came to the back to see if I was still there and say, hey, how are you, what are you going to, how are you feeling about this? What are you going to do with this? We can't believe that he's saying these things. They convinced me to go back and finish the job, and hopefully honor my professor in that way and not just bailing on them. And it was a very emotional ending to the service. But once it was finished, then I went back in to play. I found out later on that a number of people in the service had noticed that I left. In particular, the head pastor noticed that someone got up at a fairly poignant time in the sermon, and so he decided to address that. And it seems that, from what I've heard, the church community is becoming more open-minded